Let's confront an uncomfortable idea. No one tells the truth about women. All we're given are extremes, blind worship or resentment disguised as analysis. But where is the raw truth, the one hiding between silences and the fear of making people uncomfortable? We live surrounded by narratives that place women on an untouchable pedestal, symbols of purity, empathy, and almost sacred sensitivity. But what if that image is nothing more than a refined performance, a role inherited and repeated over centuries until it seems authentic? Friedrich Nietzsche dared to go where few had the courage. He didn't hate women. He didn't idealize them either. He wasn't trying to hurt or flatter. He wanted to understand. While other philosophers either worshipped them or ignored them completely, Nietzsche pulled back the curtain. He wanted to see what lies behind the soft gestures, the measured words, the socially approved archetypes. To him, the relationship between men and women wasn't built on equality or romantic love. It was driven by instinct, desire, survival. A subtle, yet brutal, game. And when we look at the world today, where the narrative of equality often masks emotional strategies and power plays, his ideas feel disturbingly relevant. But let's be clear, this is not a manifesto against anyone. It's not hatred nor blind defense. It's provocation. It's a call to lucidity. Nietzsche didn't come to console. He came to hand out mirrors. And mirrors sometimes are cruel. If you're tired of sweet stories that explain nothing, if you've already sensed that there's a discord between what is said about women and what you actually see, then this video is for you. Because after understanding how Nietzsche saw women, you'll never hear the word love without also hearing power. You won't confuse admiration with idealization anymore. In his view, man doesn't love woman. He loves the image she reflects back to him. A projection shaped by need, desire, and control. Nietzsche called it illusory romanticism, a lie wrapped in devotion, a comfortable farce sold as truth. For Nietzsche, the ideal woman never existed. She was a man's invention, born from insecurity, shaped by fear and the need for control. She wasn't a real human being, with contradictions, desires, and shadows. She was a fictional character, docile, pure, emotionally available, endlessly understanding. Under Nietzsche's gaze, that image wasn't admiration, it was evasion, an excuse to avoid confronting the true chaos of the feminine. Nietzsche claimed that man cannot tolerate the emotional freedom of woman. He cannot stand her intuitive logic, her silent mastery, her disarming ability to move between reason and instinct with natural ease. And since he can't control that, he idealizes it. He turns her into a symbol. He places her on a pedestal, so he doesn't have to engage with her real depth. But that pedestal is a trap, because every woman placed on it becomes a prisoner of the expectations it demands. And when she finally acts outside the script, when she shows strength, desire, or ambition, the man feels betrayed. Not because she changed, but because he never truly saw her. To Nietzsche, this was a refined form of cowardice. The man who cannot face woman without filters, projections, or masks is just a frightened child dressed as a gentleman. And romanticism? Nothing but fear in disguise. Fear of equality, fear of vulnerability, fear of not being in control. That's why Nietzsche didn't believe in feminine fragility as a virtue. On the contrary, he saw in women a different kind of power, less visible, but no less forceful. While men shouted their power in public squares, women learned to influence from the shadows, with calculated silences, with precise words, with a presence that disarms without violence. For centuries, they weren't allowed to wield explicit power. no armies, no thrones, but they ruled in other ways. The ability to shape the world through relationships, to plant ideas in the minds of those who made decisions. Nietzsche didn't see them as passive victims of history, but as silent strategists who knew when to advance and when to wait. The power of women, Nietzsche said, was not in brute force or direct domination. It was a more subtle, more psychological power, built on a deep understanding of human nature. Women knew, better than anyone, what moves a man: desire, pride, the need to be admired. And they didn't learn this for pleasure, but for survival. While man raised his voice, woman observed. While he imposed with force, she persuaded with silence. Not because she was weak, but because she understood that direct resistance only brought punishment. So she learned to shape without confronting, to guide without giving orders, to control without appearing to. Nietzsche admired this capacity, but he also warned, do not underestimate that power. Precisely because it's unseen, it's almost impossible to resist. He said that woman possessed a strategic instinct that bordered on the invisible. She knew how to influence without raising alarms, how to trigger decisions without ever signing an order. And this was not a disguised compliment. It was a direct strike against the naive narrative of his time, one that painted women as fragile, subordinate, lacking agency. Nietzsche saw the exact opposite. He saw calculation, intuition, sharp emotional intelligence. He wasn't accusing. He was simply pointing out what no one else dared to say aloud. Because in every human dynamic, real power is never held by the one who shouts, but by the one who is heard without speaking, the one who imposes without appearing to, the one who doesn't need to explain their influence. And in that, Nietzsche said, woman had been a master for centuries. He also claimed that human beings are not driven by objective truths, but by appearances. And in women, this awareness of how they are seen, of what they project, had been refined to the level of art. Not out of superficiality, but out of strategic necessity. Beauty, grace, aesthetics, they weren't empty ornaments. They were tools. Tools to navigate a world that only valued them if they knew how to be seen the right way. And if controlling perception means controlling the outcome, then mastering the image was mastering the game. What many called vanity or feminine manipulation, Nietzsche understood as something far deeper, a symbolic intelligence, a capacity to read the hidden desires of others. Women didn't cling to reality as it was, but to the version they knew others needed to see. And in that, they had the upper hand. This is why, Nietzsche said, women don't seduce with raw truth, but with what they know the other wants to see. Because they understood something essential. No one falls in love with what's real. They fall in love with what feels safe, beautiful, and desirable. And by shaping that perception, they weren't just responding to the world, they were shaping it. This is where Nietzsche goes even deeper. For him, truth in human relationships is never direct, because in a world where appearance carries more weight than essence, the will to seem becomes more powerful than the will to be. Women, excluded from official power for centuries, refined this art until it became a silent form of domination. He didn't call it falsehood, he called it strategy, he called it adaptive intelligence, a form of survival disguised as virtue. While many men confused image with essence, Nietzsche noticed that women distinguished the two with surgical precision. They knew the mask wasn't the face, but they also knew the mask mattered. A lot. Sometimes it was the only possible defense. To Nietzsche, this subtle charm, this ability to play with the symbolic dash, was not superficiality. It was weaponry. Delicacy was a shield. Intuition, a sword. The smile, a tactic. All of this in a world that had always denied them the right to overt power. Women learned to read the room, to read gestures, pauses, the unsaid. They learned to anticipate, to please when it served them, to withdraw when it was wise. Not because they were submissive, but because they knew that if they didn't control the game of appearances, the game would devour them. Nietzsche saw this ability as a silent form of genius, not born of privilege, but of exclusion. And here he arrives at one of his most uncomfortable ideas, that so-called feminine morality is not a universal standard. It is not divine purity. It is not moral superiority. It is a construction, a mechanism of adaptation, a way to claim space, to protect oneself, to influence dash. In a system that handed visible power to men, but in which women learned to rule from the shadows. Women, then, learned to transform patience, humility, and sacrifice into admired virtues. And from that, they built a narrative in which their vulnerability became their greatest power. Not because it was inherently true, but because it was strategically effective. Nietzsche didn't see this as deceit. He saw it as hidden genius, a form of elegant subversion, a way of bending the rules without breaking them, of reshaping structures without directly confronting them. According to him, woman did not pretend to be weak in order to manipulate. She moralized her weakness because it was the only way to survive with dignity in a world that refused to see her as equal. Delicacy, tenderness, devotion. They weren't ornaments, they were battle gear. Not decoration, but armor. Society, eager to maintain an illusion of order, embraced that performance as if it were nature, as if it were purity. But for Nietzsche, behind that stage play was instinct. Instinct for preservation, instinct for control. And when women spoke of justice, he heard calculation. When they appealed to morality, he saw strategy, not out of malice, but out of necessity. The moral stance, Nietzsche said, was never neutral. It was a tool, a refined weapon, and, in the case of women, a sharp sword wrapped in velvet. They learned to fight without raising their voice, to disarm without touching, to dominate without appearing to dominate, through silence, through emotion, through symbolic value. And none of this frightened him. It fascinated him, because he didn't see submission. He saw resistance in disguise. Nietzsche lived in a time that expected women to be passive, obedient, confined to the domestic sphere. And yet, he already sensed that something was brewing beneath that calm surface. He saw signs. Women were beginning to question, to challenge, to reject what was assigned to them. And it didn't surprise him. It unsettled him. Because he believed that female power had never been small, only monitored. Its strength was subtle, yes, but no less devastating. And so he asked, what will happen when that power no longer hides? What will happen when women no longer need a man's validation to define themselves? Nietzsche feared that the independent woman would shake the very foundations of the entire social structure, not because he doubted her capability, but because he doubted that man was ready to see her free. The average man, raised to feel superior by default, would feel deeply threatened by a woman who no longer depends on his strength, his money, or his approval. And that threat, Nietzsche warned, would not turn into respect dash, but into resentment. It wasn't misogyny. It was foresight. Nietzsche understood that a free woman, a woman who no longer needs to hide her power behind delicate gestures, becomes a tremendous force. She no longer moves out of need. She no longer asks for permission. She rises as someone whole, indivisible, with a voice of her own. And that kind of woman, decisive, clear, impossible to manipulate, was, to the traditional world, an intolerable anomaly. She didn't fit. She didn't obey. She wasn't seduced by hollow promises or interested praise. Nietzsche didn't write about this to praise or to condemn. He wrote like someone turning on a light in a room full of broken mirrors. Because he understood something essential: truth, even when uncomfortable, is what sets us free. And the rise of the conscious woman would not bring immediate balance. It would bring chaos, a necessary rupture, a painful process of readjustment for both genders. Because when a woman stops begging, the old world goes into crisis. For Nietzsche, this wasn't just inevitable. It was necessary. Structures based on dependency were destined to fall. And when they did, they wouldn't fall gracefully, but with noise, with tension, with resistance. But from those ruins, perhaps something more honest could emerge. The problem, he said, is that most relationships between men and women are built on shared fictions. He projects purity. She performs docility. He seeks to feel strong. She pretends to need him. Both play dash, without admitting they're playing. But what happens when the game stops? What happens when the man stops idealizing and the woman stops manipulating? When they no longer seek to dominate or be saved, but to see each other with rawness, with respect, with truth? Nietzsche believed this was rare, but not impossible. It demanded the death of cheap sentimentalism. It demanded letting go of inherited roles. Above all, it demanded the courage to hold someone's gaze without filters, because it is only there, that the real encounter begins, not between clashing genders, but between human beings who finally see each other. And to reach that place, real, unadorned, without disguises, we must let go of the wound. The man must release his resentment toward the woman who no longer needs him. And the woman, her anger toward the man who once silenced her. Only then can something different emerge. Not a romantic reconciliation between the sexes, but a deep redefinition of what it means to connect through truth. Nietzsche never said this was easy. He knew that most would never dare, but he also knew that some would. Those willing to lose the comfort of lies. Those who would trade illusion for clarity. And among those few, perhaps a new kind of relationship could be born. One with no winners and no losers. Where love is not based on control, on need, on inherited roles, but on shared power, on mutual respect, on real growth. If you've made it this far, it's no accident. Something in you recognized an uncomfortable truth. And I want to thank you for staying, because making it to the end doesn't just take time. It takes courage. Courage to look at human relationships without filters, with more clarity, more sincerity. And yes, more discomfort too. You know, when I started writing this script, I imagined someone like you. Someone who already sensed that the world of appearances doesn't explain everything. That behind the smiles, the gestures, the should be. There's something else. Something that's quietly falling apart, even if no one says it out loud. And now I know that person is you. But before you go, let me share something personal. I also grew up believing that love was like in the movies. Magical, perfect, destined. But it was only after breaking many times that I finally understood. Real love begins when both people take off the mask. And that's what I'm trying to build here. A space to talk about what no one talks about. A space where power, identity, desire, and truth can exist without fear. So if this video made you think, if it stirred something in you, if it showed you a different way of seeing love, let me know. Write in the comments. Love begins when fantasy ends. I want to read you. I want to know how many, like you, are ready to see without illusions. And if you want to go deeper, if this was only the first step, subscribe, because we're not here to please. We're here to understand. Until next time.